Africa, south of the Sahara, human geography. We're dealing with the economy in this video. Okay, so let's jump right into it. We're talking about the agriculture. When we talk about agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, I want you guys to think about it. And once again, this is Africa that is south of the Sahara Desert. When we're discussing this region of the continent, agriculture is the primary economic activity. So agriculture is the primary economic activity of the continent. And what we'll do now is discuss about four different ways, a few different ways that the people form. The first one is nomadic herding, which is represented by this picture. It's just what you think about really since ancient man. You're moving, you're herding sheep, you're herding goat, those things. Really the type of farming that people have been doing, nomadic herding for thousands of years. The second type of farming that we see in sub-Saharan Africa is represented by this picture. And what this is a picture of a woman in a small family garden, and it's a family plot. And that describes perfectly really what subsistence farming is. Subsistence farming is farming that is on a small scale. You're just producing enough just for you or your family to survive. You're not taking, your goal is not to produce crops to take to the market and sell. It's just for family consumption, your family survival. Also, what you'll see is that the highest percentage of Africa's population is involved in subsistence farming. So subsistence farming is the type of farming that takes up the highest percentage of Africa's population of sub-Saharan Africa. All right, so now we'll take a look at the third type of farming, which is called shifting farming. And this is once again the third type of farming that's practiced in sub-Saharan Africa. What it does, it basically involves moving every few years to find better soil. We call it in the West, we call it slash and burn farming, where you cut down and burn all the trees in the plant to kind of replenish and add nutrients to the soil. So what you'll do with shifting farming is you'll farm there for a few years. You let plants and trees and things grow. After a few years, you move to a different plot of land. You then cut down, or you then burn everything. You burn the plants as a way to replenish the nutrients in the soil. And the last type of farming that we'll get into is represented by this picture, where you see tremendous or huge machines doing farming on a large scale, and that represents commercial farming. And once again, commercial farming is just farming on a large scale. The focus of commercial farming, it's different than subsistence farming, or different from the majority of farming that you see in Africa. It's actually you're farming to make a profit, and that is what we tend to think about here in the United States. It's farming to make a profit. Your crop is grown to be sold. It's not grown necessarily for the family consumption to live. And the smallest percentage of this type of farming is done by a very, very small percent of the population of sub-Saharan Africa's population. Now let's transition to some of the different problems that are faced by farmers. A really big one two really big ones are represented by the two pictures. And of course, in this picture that you see now, you'll see it appears to be a very desert area, a very dry area. In both pictures, it definitely does not look like it's the kind of area where the soil is fertile. And these are four of the problems that farmers are facing in sub-Saharan Africa. One is overgrazing. That is just when you farm too much on land and you deplete all the nutrients. Very similar to overworked soil. So look, overgrazing is when animals eat too much. Overworked soil is when we as people grow too much. Lack of technology, lack of modern farming techniques, and desertification, which is just the natural, due to the climate, nature area become more of a desert area. Another part of Africa's farming, which is represented by these two pictures, what you see is a guy appears to be a worker in a cave, working in a cave or working underground. Both pictures, and the second pictures of definitely people working underground in rocks, and that is with mining. Okay, so it's not something that we have more experience with the oil industry here, but in parts of the United States, that mining is a tremendously big industry. You work underground, mining for minerals, gold, coal, those sorts of things. Mining is another aspect of sub-Saharan Africa's economy. and it's another economic activity. Now, of course, there are uneven distribution of mineral resources. So what that just means is, we know this, there are certain countries that will have more gold or more resources than other countries. Those countries that have more resources tend to be involved in more mining. And also, mining is very difficult and dangerous work. If you guys take a look at these pictures, you can tell you are literally, depending on the type of mining you're doing, you're literally underground. The next part of Sub-Saharan Africa's economy we'll discuss briefly is manufacturing, which is represented by this picture of ladies in a factory doing work in a factory. You do not see this a lot in Sub-Saharan Africa, or let me say, you do not see this as much as you would think you would see, because this part of this continent is abundant with natural resources. So you would think that with all of the natural resources, they would then be manufacturing to help develop those natural resources, or to turn those natural resources to finished products. Like when we get oil, the oil you take out of the ground, you cannot put that in your car. It has to go through a refining process. So you would think that is what would occur here in Sub-Saharan Africa. It does not. The opposite actually occurs. Manufacturing in Sub-Saharan Africa is not well developed. Sub-Saharan Africa supplies raw materials for industrialized countries throughout the world. So what that means is that the raw materials are mined in Sub-Saharan Africa, and then they're then shipped off to the Americas or Europe, to where the factories in those places can process those, can transition those raw materials from raw materials to finished products. Some of the obstacles that Africa experiences, reasons why they do not have industrialization, and reasons why they do not have a developed manufacturing infrastructure. Lack of funding, which means lack of investment, lack of skilled workers, political conflicts that interrupt with economic planning. When we talk about the political conflicts, when we talk about all of these things, the obstacles to industrialization, if you remember back to the previous video, I mentioned briefly about the internal strife, or the political instability caused by the different ethnic groups that the countries are formed. When the countries were formed by the European powers in Africa, they formed the countries with different ethnic groups within one country. Tremendous amount of political instability when you have governments constantly being toppled, or civil war, or when you have unstable governments, it makes it hard for business to come in and people to invest and develop manufacturing infrastructure, those things that you need. Next picture, lack of transportation. Some of the things that cause this part of the world's lack of a developed transportation system. We'll be talking about roads, just paved roads, highways, interstate systems, all those things. The reason why you do not see those things are a few things. Wars, going back to, we discussed unstable governments, political strife, lack of funding, same things we're talking about for the obstacles to industrialization. The physical geography, it can be a very, certain parts of the continent it's very challenging terrain. And number four is kind of a result of all of these things, which means that you have a lack of experts and skilled managers to help plan and supervise transportation systems, because you have wars, because you have lack of funding, because you have some of these things that are going on, and you have an education system that is not as developed as it could be, which we'll move to next. Discussing the education in Sub-Saharan Africa. The literacy rate is about 60%. So what that means is about 60% of the people of age 15 or older can read or write. The average for the world is about 83.7%. The average for the United States is about 99%. So what that means is about 99% of the people, the population in the United States can read or write on some level. Well, 60% on in this region of Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. They're dealing with the rural areas. They often have fewer schools, lack of materials and qualified teachers. And of course, this leads to the lower literacy rates that I discussed in the urban areas. Economic situation of a family. Sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of Sub-Saharan Africa is third world countries, right? Very similar, or it's like the third world countries we studied in Central America and South America. So very similar economic situations. Oftentimes children cannot go to work, cannot go to school, they have to go to work to support the family. Then touching lastly, we'll talk about the communication, not well developed. All of this ties back into unstable governments, to the constant fighting and wars that are going on within the countries that make it impossible to do things to set up the basic infrastructure that we think about whenever we think of just the basic necessities of life. Communication, not a lot of telephones, not a lot of setting up basic things like telephone wires, cell phone services, television stations. It's not a lot of that, okay? Not like we have here in the United States. The people rely very heavily on radio. Very few people actually have access to television, relatively speaking. The low literacy in areas. Another thing, another result of having a smaller percentage of your population being able to read, that means it's harder to keep things like newspapers and magazines in business. So you end up having fewer newspapers and magazines than you would expect for a continent this size. The telephone area, the telephone service everywhere is limited, especially in rural areas. And these two pictures show you, I want to give you an example of what it would look like, telephone service would look like in rural Africa, okay? So we're looking at, this is a telephone cabin. You would go in. This is where, if you ask your parents, at once upon a time, there used to be payphones in every corner in the United States before cell phones. They still have these. Now, it did not look like this. But what happens is you will go in, put a quarter in the machine, and it will allow you to talk to people. And people can call you back on this machine, on the telephone in the cabin. This is another example of what a payphone looks like. So this is what a lot of people in Africa, this is their personal that's not personal for telephones. It's a telephone everyone in that area shares, and you have to pay for it. All right, remember, highlight the answers to the homework learning targets in your notes guide. Answer the questions in bold lettering. The end. Have a good day. I'll see you in class.